So my name is Kari Kumar, and I'm a lecturer in the Faculty of Health Sciences at UOIT. I teach in the nursing program. My background is in microbiology, actually. So I have a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science in microbiology. I've been teaching for about 8 years in higher ed, and over the last couple of years I've gotten really interested in learning more about education itself. And so my current passion is now learning about how to make education more inclusive and more accessible. And that's actually the current focus of my doctoral research. There were a couple of things that took place when I first began teaching in university that got me, triggered my interest in universal design for learning. One of those was that when I first began to teach, I was a very successful student. And I thought, I know exactly what students need to do to succeed, and I know what I liked as a student from my teachers, so this is how I'm going to teach my class. And I quickly realized that that was quite naive, and that my students are quite a diverse group of people. They don't necessarily learn the same way that I like to learn. And I needed to think about reworking my teaching practices to be more inclusive of their different needs. At the same time, I used to teach very large classes, and so I used to get quite a number of accommodation forms from students from the Center for Students with Disabilities. And I wasn't aware of this as a student, that such a center existed, and I really didn't know what these accommodation forms were about. I didn't understand why some of my students requested, for example, extra time on tests. So I felt that there was somewhat of an air of mystery about what this was all about, and I wanted to learn more about the needs of students with disabilities. Several years later, once I began to become more interested in education itself and becoming formally trained as an educator, I decided to take some courses specifically related to students with disabilities, and that's when I became much more enlightened, and that's when I became aware of universal design for learning. And since then, universal design for learning, I would say, is a major component of my teaching philosophy, and it's now also shaped my research interests and activities as well. So UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, is a framework that we can apply towards thinking about how to make education more accessible or inclusive of the needs of our students. So there are various sets of guidelines that can sort of act like a checklist, in a sense, if you will, in terms of how to make your courses more accessible to the needs of your students. So there are various iterations of UDL. The bottom line, though, is that UDL suggests that we should be more flexible and more adaptable for the needs of our students. If we can impart more flexibility and adaptability into the curriculum, into the way that we design and deliver our courses, then that takes the burden of adaptability off the shoulders of our students and essentially puts it into the course. And that really makes a lot more sense, to be as flexible as we can without compromising on the academic rigor of our courses. UDL is important because flexibility, adaptability, these are things that every student is going to appreciate. So all of our students would appreciate different choices with respect to how to demonstrate their learning, for example. And in particular, students with disabilities also can benefit perhaps the most from flexible course design. So this may negate their need to request accommodations as frequently as they would otherwise. So that can be very beneficial. Requesting accommodations and disclosing disability is something that students with disabilities often feel very uncomfortable with. So enhancing the flexibility of our course can help to perhaps alleviate some of that discomfort. And it also demonstrates to all of the students that we have an interest in meeting their needs and that we recognize that they're a diverse group of people. So I think there's a lot of value in that. So UDL is different from accommodation. Accommodation is when a student might present you with a form from the Center for Students with Disabilities that might say, for example, if there's a test coming up, that I should have additional time to write that test. So in a sense, the student gets slightly different accommodation from the rest of the class in order to ensure that they have an equitable opportunity to succeed. UDL is different in that we can try to impart more flexibility into the course so that there are flexible options for the students, so they may or may not need to request that accommodation as frequently as necessary. So principles of UDL can really be woven into all aspects of teaching. And for example, we can think about how UDL might be applicable to assessments. If we know that there's a particular learning objective or a takeaway for a particular topic that the student should be familiar with, we might say, well, this is the learning objective, and then they might have multiple options of expressing their understanding of that. So if we create an assignment, for example, perhaps there could be different options for the students. One example that I used in my teaching is I want my students to give a presentation. I want them to give a presentation to demonstrate their understanding of a topic and also to get experience giving an academic presentation. So I design a mock conference for the class, and the students decide, do they want to give an oral presentation or do they want to give a poster presentation? Both of these options are equally academically rigorous, but they challenge the students in different ways. So students can then choose the option that they feel they're most comfortable with, or that they feel perhaps that challenges them the most. And so there's some flexibility there with respect to how the students express themselves. Another example that I think is really helpful is using more learning technologies in our teaching. So for example, if we have a course website, if we use a learning management system, we can post content relevant to the course there for the students to access. For example, we can post outlines or organizers or handouts in advance of a particular class. Students then have the option, if they want, and if it's important for them, to even access some of that content before the relevant class in order to get themselves organized for the note-taking process. So people often talk about UDL and good teaching practices and might say that, well, if you have good teaching practices, you may find that you're already meeting many of the guidelines or principles of UDL. And I think that's true to a certain extent. I like to think of UDL as sort of an overarching mindset or sort of an overarching umbrella that whenever we're looking at or evaluating our teaching practices, we might look to see, well, is there anywhere where I can impart a little bit more flexibility here? So I may be using very good teaching practices, but perhaps I can allow more options for my students. So in a sense, they do go hand in hand, but I do think of UDL as more of an overarching umbrella, sort of surrounding everything, and more of a mindset, really. If a teacher is first thinking about trying UDL or applying the principles of UDL to their teaching, of course the first thing I would recommend is to learn a little bit more about it and to learn more about some practical examples. I think that can be very helpful. My favorite source of resources about UDL is CAST, the Center for Applied Special Technologies. They have fabulous resources online, lots of practical examples, and lots of examples about how to use technology as well to help meet the needs of all of your students. So I would recommend absolutely looking into some of these resources, talking to colleagues who might also be interested in UDL. And I think another major challenge here is that when we talk about inclusiveness or accessibility, these are very subjective variables, and what might be helpful for one student may not be so helpful for the other. So at the same time, if you do implement some changes to your teaching with UDL in mind, I would highly recommend talking to your students, because how do you know if it's effective or if you really are enhancing the inclusiveness of your course besides getting a little bit of feedback from your students? So I would recommend not being shy and asking your students, am I meeting your needs here? Or is there some place where you feel the course is a little bit too rigid, where we might like to try something new?